Welcome. Welcome. You are listening to audio from the table. If you'd like to learn more about our community or donate to this ministry, please visit thetabletx.com.
Grace and peace. Table Podcast listeners, Brett here. So glad to be with you all. So we are in part 4 in our series titled Enchanted, Reclaiming Sacred Ground in a Disenchanted World. And in the series, we're basically contending that we live in an increasingly secular world, at least in the West, that's really doing its best to move away from what's commonly thought of as religion, like away from the big stories that have helped humans make sense of the world for thousands of years, including, of course, the Christian story. However, in ways, actually, we're not really moving away from religion so much. We're just like treating nation states and economic systems and science and things like that in more and more religious ways. So also an unintended side effect is that it's kind of draining the sacredness, the depth dimension, the meaning out of everything secularism touches. So this series is really about helping us to kind of realize that in Christ and the broader Christian tradition, we have the resources we need to push back on this sort of bland Western techno-capitalist secular tradition and begin to kind of reinfuse and re-enchant our own view of the world and the cosmos, and in the process find healing for ourselves and the people we love and our neighbors. So the title of my message this week is Tree-Hugging Christians. We have 2 primary scriptures today, both of them from the book of Psalms. First is Psalm chapter 104, verses 24 through 28. How many are your works, Lord? In wisdom you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. There is the sea, vast and spacious, teeming with creatures beyond number, living things both large and small. There the ships go to and fro, and Leviathan, which you formed to frolic there. All creatures look to you to give them their food at the proper time. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are satisfied with good things. The second is Psalm chapter 139, verses 7 through 10. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast. So our view of creation, of trees and fields, rivers and oceans, birds and fishes and humans and suns and moons, all of it is deeply rooted in how we imagine, how we understand God's relationship to creation. And that's actually really shifted dramatically over time. So today in the modern secular world, kind of our imagination for creation is actually not that it's creation at all. We call it nature. And our default view is that it's a vast machine, right? For the way we kind of envision reality is ultimately as just material bits of things, kind of following mathematical, scientific laws. And God, if there is a God, we imagine he sort of wound up the cosmos like a clock or something, and now it's just kind of running all on its own until it doesn't. And this is known as deism. So a deist would believe in God, but feels that God is kind of absent from the cosmos, right? God kind of got it all going, but now it's like an absentee parent. How did we, and really by we, I don't just mean secular people, but Christians too, how did we come to begin to think like this? Well, to help kind of unpack that, in the first part of the sermon, I want to start by talking about how we imagine God's relationship to creation or to the cosmos, or for shorthand, we might just use the term world, kind of how that relationship is. And in this first view, you'll likely see how something like a kind of deistic view comes about, and how that in turn starts to kind of degrade our view of creation. By the way, before I jump into that, in this first part, I'm drawing on a blog post by Richard Beck that he wrote on the theology of Sergius Bulgakov, the Eastern Orthodox theologian. And so much of what follows in like these next three images specifically is kind of a summary of his blog post. So, okay, so without further ado, let me jump in here. So most Christians imagine the God-world relationship to be something like this. And here, because as a podcast, you're not there on a Sunday where you can see the screens up, on the walls. I'm going to kind of help you envision this. So you can kind of imagine like a PowerPoint slide. The background is sort of a light blue color. And then you have two circles with an arrow pointing from one to the other. So in one circle, it's kind of a darker blue, and that says God. And then the arrow's pointing away from God towards a second circle right next to it. And that circle says world. So this, well, it may kind of surprise you to know, like, this is actually, like, yes, this is how we often kind of understand creation to be, but it's really actually a problematic way to understand things. Why is that? Well, here, creation, right, the world, the cosmos, has a certain autonomy, a certain independence and distance from God. Right, this is the first step towards a disenchanted view of creation. It's no longer participating in spirit. It's no longer charged with the grandeur and glory of God. Right, this is kind of the first step towards deism. Like it's sort of creation's imagined as kind of cut off and distant from God. Also, the way we imagine God kind of interacting with creation now gets all messed up, because right, God is understood as separate from the world. And, of course, God's free to kind of jump in and meddle from time to time, do a miracle here or there, send Jesus in, but mostly God's kind of on the sidelines watching, from the outside, so to speak. Also, this is problematic because it starts to understand God as kind of a being who exists alongside creation, right? So you have the world exists, or the cosmos exists, and then God exists, is a thing. But here we're kind of sliding into imagining God as a Zeus-like, being, like a super deity, a kind of lowercase g God, like a God, but lowercase g God, right? Which then kind of gets you wondering, okay, well, if you got these two circles, God, world, these two things that exist, but they're kind of suspended from nothing, like, how's that working, right? In other words, what is this thing, this kind of background that's like sustaining or upholding creation and God? Like, is capital B being, is like existence itself sort of holding up God in the world? Is being prior to more important than kind of foundational for like God and creation? All right, we'll address that in the third view. By the way, I realize this is quite like sort of philosophical, theological. Don't worry, we'll get more practical and such later in the message. But I just want to kind of reorient how we imagine the God-world relationship, because we're often, we do theology all the time. We just don't think about the fact that we're doing theology or, thinking in theological or philosophical ways. All right, so another kind of problematic way to think of the God-world relationship is as what we might kind of call God/world. So again, you can't see the PowerPoint slide, but just imagine there's kind of the light blue again. This time, though, there's only one dark blue circle. And in that one circle, it just says God/world, right? So this is where God is creation. Creation is God. This is known as pantheism. And honestly, it runs into some of the same problems as the view we just mentioned, in that God here is still a being, a thing. But in this case, it's just God is a being called Earth, or star, or galaxy, or tree, or flower. Also, Christian orthodoxy really wants to say that God is both immanent to the world, which means like intimately acquainted with, involved in, connected to, participating in creation, but also transcendent to it, sort of the source of it, above it, beyond creation, so to speak. And so for those reasons, it's found this view to be kind of problematic, and most Christian theologians reject this view as well. Okay, so what's kind of a different way to understand all of this, and the way that I would suggest we do? So it's not known as pantheism, but rather as panentheism. So in this final image, again, you have kind of this one circle, dark blue circle that says world, or, creation or whatever. But then you have the background of the slide itself. That's a lighter blue. And that is labeled God, right? So in other words, here, God is all that is. God is, you might say, capital B, being itself. Some theologians have like the term or the metaphor, the ground of being. Like in the same way, everything sort of emanates from, arises from the ground on this earth. The trees and flowers and grass and organisms and, all sorts of things kind of emerge from that. You might imagine there God as sort of the ground of being itself, capital B, being, that then gives rise to lowercase b beings. It allows them to exist. You might even think of it as like God as sort of like the way a mother, has a womb and creates this kind of space within her very body for something that is not exactly the mother, right? The baby, the child. And yet the child, when it's in the womb, is still, it's very intimately acquainted with the mother. You know what I mean? Like it's not technically the mom, but there's a closeness and intimacy there, right? Where the mother kind of makes a space for that which is not the mother to exist. And that's sort of this view, is God is like that mother, and creation here is like a womb, right? So in other words, I in all things, I'm not exactly identical to God. The oceans, the rivers, the trees, all creation, not exactly God per se, and yet because they exist at all, because I exist, because you exist, all things exist, we are in some deeper sense immersed in the ocean of being, right? And thus we are truly in God. We are surrounded by, we are sustained by, capital B, being God. Another metaphor could be like, imagine a sponge at the bottom of the ocean. And in that moment, it's not exactly like the ocean per se, but again, it is intimately acquainted to the ocean. In fact, because it's porous, it's actually sort of filled with ocean. And yet also the ocean is more than the sponge, right? So there you get that kind of image of like immanent to, close to, and transcendent to, above, beyond, higher than, and other than that which exists. And so in essence, what I'm driving at is like you too, and not just you, but really all things are actually immersed in God. Can you see where this is so profoundly different than the first image, the first slide we talked about, where God like creates the world, but we're kind of separated from, cut off from God, unless God kind of chooses to like meddle a little bit or something. So in this third way of imagining, this panentheistic view, I think this is where Eastern Orthodox and Catholic theology have basically done, they acknowledge the fall of creation, right? Recognizing that lowercase b, being, is imperfect. But they've done a much better job than Protestants at retaining what I call a sort of sanctified kind of spiritual imagination for creation. In his book, The Catholic Imagination, a writer and theologian named Andrew Greeley puts it this way. He says, Catholics live in an enchanted world, a world of statues and holy water, stained glass and votive candles, saints and religious medals, rosary beads and holy pictures. Because these Catholic paraphernalia are mere hints of a deeper and more pervasive sensibility which inclines Catholics to see the holy lurking in creation. He continues, as Catholics, we find our houses and world haunted by a sense that the objects, the events and persons of daily life are revelations of grace. Oh, I think that's beautifully said, right? The holy is lurking in creation. So it's not pantheism, not quite that God, the Holy, the Spirit is literally just is creation. As though I need to, if I have to chop down a tree or something, it's like, I've killed God, not exactly. And yet, but kind of, in the sense of the objects, the events, the plants, the animals, the minerals, the persons of daily life are a kind of revelation of God, revelations, hints of grace and spirit. So this is all leading to what's known as a sacramental understanding of the world. So what is a sacrament? So a sacrament is really anything that both points to and participates in divine mysteries. The way James K. Smith put it is he says, a sacramental understanding holds that the physical kind of material stuff of creation and embodiment, in other words, of our bodies, of our being, is the very means by which God's grace meets us and gets a hold of us. This is why Christianity is very, I don't know quite what the word is, but like something like earthy in its official sacraments. So each church kind of has, certain things that are known as like the sacraments. For example, one, probably the most popular, well-known, is the sacrament of communion or Eucharist. So this is like kind of a holy mystery, right? It's a sacrament because it points to and participates in divine mysteries. But think of what the Eucharist is about. Like, what is it? What material things is it kind of using here? Well, it consists of bread and wine. Right? This is like extremely kind of physical, material, earthy. This is not just airy-fairy mysteries. This is like using things of the earth as kind of an icon to like point beyond it to their divine source that they point to and they participate in God. It's also why we use water in another sacrament, the sacrament of baptism. In fact, some churches even practice another sacrament known as foot washing. And what's the kind of point of all this? Well, I'd say what's happening here is and we'll say more about this in a little bit, but we want to use the sacraments of the church as a sort of jumping off point to understand this truth, that actually all creation, everything and everyone is sacramental. In other words, all of it points to and participates in the divine. And of course, the implications of this, like they're just unbelievably far-reaching and I feel really profound. For the sake of time, I'm going to just limit myself to 4 implications today. So in essence, a panentheistic sacramental view of creation means that, number one, to be eco-friendly is not some fringe view of leftist eco-pantheists. Right? Like, no, to be ecologically friendly, it's not some leftist thing. It's rather, it should be the common concern of all Christians. Right? Coming back to that first image of kind of God over here, and then he creates this other thing called the world or cosmos, whatever. Like this, you can see where this tends to degrade our view of creation. Because as we named earlier, we start to see it as utterly cut off from God, separate from God, rather than, again, yes, in some sense imperfect or fallen, but still sacramental, holy, still pointing to and literally participating in God's very being. And so it's really unfortunate that Christians aren't known, generally speaking, as tree huggers. Christians aren't known as like being on the vanguard of environmentalism. We should be, because all creation is good and is shot through, participates in, is suspended from the very being of God. So I think all Christians really should have the sensitivity to the natural world of a poet and the open-hearted kind of concern of an activist. So that's the first implication of this kind of panentheistic sacramental view of creation. Second implication, factory farming and other degrading practices which treat animals like machines are not in alignment with the best of Christian theology. I think back to more indigenous cultures, which we need to learn from, because we kind of need to rediscover our own view of, creation theology and such from kind of other traditions, because we've become so cut off from our own. So just think of how in indigenous cultures, even as they killed an animal, they understood what they were doing as a sacred thing, right? Which is where they had certain rituals around it, certain prayers and such that were uttered, because they didn't, view, say, killing a buffalo as turning off power to the meat machine. No, the buffalo is holy. Why was it holy? Because they saw it as, in some sense, participating in what they would have called the Great Spirit, but God. I can remember actually Christian adults from my childhood making fun of Hindus because they kind of laughingly, they said they think cows are holy, which we of course found ridiculous. We said, that's ridiculous. Cows aren't holy. Trees aren't holy. That's what pantheists think. And we're Christians and we have a degraded view of creation. Okay, I'm getting a little snarky, but how freaking ignorant are we of our own tradition? It's unbelievable, right? In a sacramental understanding, everything's spiritual. Everything's holy. The buffalo is holy. The cow is holy. The tree is holy. Right? And then of course the human being is holy. This invites us to, I think, to a much kind of deeper thought and care. Things like, pay attention as best you can to where your food's coming from. Consider eating less meat or even just becoming vegetarian entirely. I mean, just think of it. For maybe the first time in human history, we actually live in an age where we can get all the calories we need without having to kill animals. I think that's a big shift and a huge opportunity in a way to kind of preserve, to show a loving attention and care to creation, where we're kind of, doing the least amount of harm possible as we kind of move through this life, this wonderful cosmos. The third implication, I and all creatures are never, quote, far from God, end quote, right? To exist as a being is to arise from the source of all being, God. In other words, we may feel distant and alienated, but that's a trick of the mind, perhaps due to our fallen nature. And if the saints are to be believed, really that's a state that can, by grace, actually be overcome. We can, by God's grace, again, grow into a sense of union with God, with Christ, with the Holy Spirit, with all things, trees and fish and brooks and birds. Fourth and finally, the sacraments and the liturgy of the church. Things like communion, music, baptism, prayer. These are not somehow boundaries on God, but actually jumping off points to help us see ultimately all of life in creation as sacramental. In other words, it's not about saying, okay, now certain things are the holy things and everything else, well, that's not holy, No, the idea is that by learning to relate to them with reverence, we then learn to relate to the rest of daily life in a spirit of prayerful reverence, right? In other words, if you can come forward and take communion in a kind of prayerful, aware posture, well, then maybe you can start to relate to your partner or your coworkers or your children in that kind of way. So in essence, right, the idea is by learning to relate to them with reverence, then it opens us up to relate to all things. Like this is why the Christian mystics are also just incredibly ecologically friendly. Because, folks like, say, St. Francis of Assisi had an incredibly sacramental, holy imagination, right? He saw the moon. That wasn't just the moon, just nature, some, scientific law. That's brother moon. That's not just the sun. That's sister sun and cousin bird. And, he saw that all creation is like his family. Why? Because God is, capital B, being, which gives rise to us, to all things. And so there's a deep oneness, a sense of connection to myself and God and all that is. So I'm going to go ahead and close with a quote from a character in one of Fyodor Dostoevsky's novels, The Brothers Karamazov. And it's based off of, this character is based off various Christian saints down through history. So the monk in the novel, his name is Father Zosima. And he says this: "My brother asked the birds to forgive him. That sounds senseless, but it is right. For all is like an ocean. All is flowing and blending. A touch in one place sets up movement at the other end of the earth. It may be senseless to beg forgiveness of the birds, but birds would be happier at your side. A little happier anyway. And children, and all animals, if you were nobler than you are now. It's all like an ocean, I tell you. Then you would pray to the birds too, consumed by an all-embracing love, in a sort of transport, and pray that they too will forgive you your sin. Treasure this ecstasy, however senseless it may seem to men." In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.